that tells us it's not the divorce itself, it's the behavior of the parents that impacts on the children. And children experience divided loyalty, and as parents become more enmeshed in who's right and who's wrong, and fighting the good fight to win, they lose sight of what their children really need, which is the right to love both of them, the right to be loved by both of them. And every time a parent says something negative about the other parent, every time, well, we can't afford that because your father didn't give us enough money, that creep who's off with his girlfriend, and we can't do that because I give your mother all the money, she's so greedy and selfish, and I work for, nothing for myself. The more that goes on, the more the children don't know what to do. They almost feel like they can't let mommy know that they love daddy, and they can't let daddy know that they love mommy. And it's such a scary place for a child to be. It's like being in the middle of a war zone. And
what say do the children have in all this?
Very little.
Let's be, aside from parent coordinators, let's say before the parent coordinator movement came along, what were the outlet for the kids?
Sometimes judges in very high conflict cases would appoint either a law guardian who is a lawyer for the child, right, or a guardian ad litem who is an individual that can be either a lawyer or mental health professional to do an investigation and issue a report on the best interest of the child. Also, courts in custody disputes frequently appoint psychological experts who do forensic evaluations, and they are psychologists, and they do. Well, they also can be social workers and, and marriage and family therapists, but largely psychologists, and they do evaluations where they make recommendations to the court on what should happen in terms of custody. In the context of those evaluations, children are interviewed, and their thoughts and feelings in some respect are reported back to the court. So I guess that's the children's voice.
Or an in-camera interview with the judge at some point.
Absolutely.
Some judges will talk to the children and some won't.
Right. There are judges who, judges are encouraged to do that when there's a real dispute and the child is old enough to have some say. But you're right, there are some judges that don't like to do that, and it's also very scary. It's hard for a child to have to go in and talk to a stranger, somebody that they've never met, who's, in a office in a big courthouse, and they know that they're there at court because mommy and daddy are fighting over them. Very intimidating.
Now, does every case require a parent coordinator?
Every case does not require a parenting coordinator, but I am a strong believer that to the extent that there's a communication education component to parenting coordination, a lot of people who don't take advantage of the process would actually benefit from it. Part of what parenting coordinators do is teach these parents how to talk to each other and how to communicate and how to get to effective results for their children. It's very different communicating as a married couple, particularly one in a dysfunctional marriage that's unraveling, and communicating post-divorce when your issues are theoretically resolved and now you still have to work together to raise your children.
Now, there is a program in the divorce process at the very beginning called a Parents Education Workshop, or some such name, where the parents are required to attend an evening or an afternoon at the courthouse where they're lectured by maybe a judge and a social worker or maybe a psychologist, or maybe, I don't know whether you've done that, but they're taught about the effects of divorce on children and how to help them along and not affect their children. That's the kind of education you're talking about.
Yes, and it's an excellent program what you're speaking of, because it really does give people an overview and helps them to change their mindset and maybe think twice before they engage in the fight, particularly in front of the children or where it directly affects the children. In parenting coordination, some of the same thing happens, but it's more one-on-one.
You're hands-on, right?
Hands-on. You're working with this individual couple with their individual issues, not the crowd at large.
What's the typical type of a case that you get involved in, if there is such a thing?
I don't know that any case is typical, because one thing I learned a long time ago is that every family law case is as different as every family. I tend to have a lot of cases that are very high conflict, and people that start out where some of them don't even want to be in the same room together. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to understand the dynamic and to appreciate the individual's personality and what's going on with them and why they feel the way they do about the other person. But generally, once we start working, a lot of different ideas about how children should be raised, what children need. People disagree on everything from whether or not their children need orthodontics to whether or not their child should be allowed to sleep over.
Or play soccer.
Or play soccer, absolutely.
Or any number of things.
Any number of things.
Okay, so when do you get involved in the process?
It again depends on the case. Most parenting coordination cases initiate, I'm going to say post-judgment, right after.
After a divorce.
Right after the divorce.
It would make more sense for you to get involved earlier.
I agree, and I have a number of those cases.
In fact, I've been using parent coordinators earlier on to help the case along.
Yes, and I think you're onto something. I think you are one of the attorneys who's actually using the process wisely, because if you get a parenting coordinator involved early on, a lot of the little disputes that ends up costing people more money because they're constantly calling their lawyers to resolve little issues. A lot of those nuances of communication can be resolved by the parenting coordinator, and I think the parties, by establishing more effective communication early on, actually do better in resolving their divorce without going to trial.
The judges must love you.
I hope so.
Well, think about it. If every dispute between parents over their children isn't resolved and you weren't here on the scene, they'd be before the judge, right?
Absolutely.
Either with attorneys or pro se, representing themselves.
Absolutely.
So the judges probably call you in on all these cases to lighten their load, so to speak.
I'm sure that's part of it. I think that a lot of the judges, and I think we're fortunate in New Jersey because a lot of the judges really do have the mindset of wanting people to learn how to do it themselves. I think they understand that it really isn't beneficial for that well-meaning stranger in a black robe to make that decision. They can, they will. They do,
right.
but they don't want to because they know it's healthier for children and for people to make their own choices.
How much of your function is counseling the parents versus counseling the children?
Parenting coordination is not counseling.
Okay.
So while there's certainly a therapeutic component, the guidelines are very clear that we are not mediators, we are not arbitrators, we are not therapists, we are not lawyers. We don't really advocate for one person or the other, and we're supposed to have a clear and neutral mindset to every issue that comes up. If there's any bias in parenting coordination, the bias really needs to be in favor of the children and with the focus on the children. So, I find that most of my work is on helping the parents communicate and resolve their own issues. That's where a lot of my focus is.
Right. That's what I'm talking about counseling. If one parent is saying, is very harsh, talking to a child about the other parent, don't you have to say to that parent, knock it off?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, that's a form of counseling, but...
It is. And there's definitely a therapeutic or counseling undertone to parenting coordination because, yes, there's education involved. And, yes, you have to say to a parent like you described, hello, this is not good what you're doing to your child. This is how they're hearing it. How would you feel if somebody said this to you? And, to try to change the way they're looking at what they're saying and how they're reacting.
Now, when you're engaged as a parent coordinator, there's usually an agreement or a consent order that gets entered with the court.
Correct.
Let's talk about the terms of that, okay? Because it's a contract.
It is.
Right? It's a contract that really has the force and effect of a court order. In fact, it's usually turned into a court order called a consent order, right?
Right.
That's a judge ordering you to be the parent coordinator on certain terms.
Right.
All right, let's talk about those terms.
Okay.
How long are you appointed for?
It varies. Most parenting coordination contracts are in place for at least a year.